The great city of Baltimore has always had an inferiority complex. In 1835, the city was nicknamed Mobtown for reasons that only historians today remember, but the nickname stuck. In the 1950s and 60s, Baltimore was the sixth largest city in the United States. Only New York, Chicago, LA, Philadelphia, and Detroit were larger. But Baltimore never had the prestige associated with being a major metropolis. Instead, Baltimore's long been overshadowed by its more prominent neighbors, with Washington, D.C. a mere 40 miles to the south and Philadelphia just 80 miles to the northeast. Every kid in grade school is taught that Philadelphia was America's first capital in 1776 when the Declaration of Independence was signed, and that Washington, D.C. is the current capital of the United States. But if the answer on Final Jeopardy is ever, after Congress was evacuated from Philadelphia during the Revolutionary War, this city briefly served as America's second capital, only Ken Jennings could correctly write down what is Baltimore. Yup, it's true. A red brick tavern on Baltimore Street named the Henry Fight House, which eventually became known as Old Congress Hall, served for a few months as the new nation's seat of government. It eventually burned down during the Great Baltimore Fire of 1902. Today, nobody remembers this bit of history. They just remember Mobtown. It's like Baltimore were the Rodney Dangerfield of cities. No respect. Kids aren't taught in school about the role the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad played in the transformation of the United States into a modern industrial power. They know it only as one of the properties in the game Monopoly. Nobody knows that modern communication was invented in 1844 when the very first telegraph message, "What hath got wrought," was sent by Samuel Morse from Washington, D.C. to his assistant in Baltimore. And nobody remembers that in 1816, Baltimore became the first American city with gas streetlights. Which is ironic because Baltimore's great history has been gaslighted. During the 1950s and 60s, Baltimore didn't air Philadelphia's American Bandstand on television because Baltimore had its own show, The Buddy Dean Show. Nobody remembers that the song The Twist was originally made by Hank Ballard and the Midnighters, who first made the song and dance popular performing it on Baltimore's Buddy Dean Show. But people do remember the rip-off remake that Dick Clark created when he recorded a local Philadelphia unknown sound-alike singer who he made famous when he renamed him Chubby Checker and put him on American Bandstand. By the middle of the 20th century, Baltimore was one of the nation's leading industrial and manufacturing centers with the second largest seaport on the East Coast. Because of this, Baltimore had a deep history of attracting immigrants, which added to the city's cultural richness, with famous ethnic and diverse German, Italian, Greek, Jewish, and Polish neighborhoods. This, combined with the Chesapeake Bay's treasure chest of delicious seafood, created a local cuisine that could rival any other part of the country. During the 50s and 60s, Baltimore wasn't cosmopolitan, it was blue-collar. The people of Baltimore were working class and damn proud of it. They didn't drink martinis or Manhattans. They drank beer, and not imported crap, but homemade Natty Boh. And any true Baltimorean would prefer a bull roast, or better yet, a crab feast, than to eat in some fancy Michelin 5-star French restaurant. And that there was nothing better on the planet than a real Baltimorean crab cake. People like my grandfather worked their whole lives Downey Mill at Bethlehem Steel, while their wives with their beehive hairdos stayed home scrubbing the famous white marble steps of their immaculately kept row houses. In the 1960s, these women became known as Huns, not because they were like Attila the Hun, but because in Baltimore the term Hun is universally used as a shortened term of endearment for honey, offering friendly small-town hospitality instead of big city hustle and bustle. "How you doing, Hun?" The Baltimorean nasally accent has been famously parodied and mocked. Planning a summer trip to the beach at Ocean City was called "Going Down the Ocean." Nobody pronounces the T in the city's name. It's never Baltimore. It's either Balmer or Baltimore. And Maryland is not pronounced Maryland. There's no Y, there's no D. It's Maryland. Balmer, Maryland. From 1941 until 1966, the NHL was made up of only 6 teams. The original 6 era has often been romanticized as a glorious era for the sport of hockey because the highly competitive and exclusive NHL was limited to only about 110 players. The truth is, the original six era sucked for both the fans and the players. Without a national television contract, only those fortunate enough to live in one of those six cities were able to watch NHL hockey. The majority of Americans never had a chance to see greats like Rocket Richard play. For most of the public, hockey players of the original six era were nothing but just a bunch of obscure names printed in the back of the sports section of the newspaper. For the players, it was even worse. The NHL was a monopoly controlled by just a handful of people. All-time great Ted Lindsay's career was destroyed by the owners when he attempted to form a players' union. The players were underpaid and were treated like chattel without any rights, with the NHL teams exercising total control over them. However, the 1960s was an era of turbulent change in which the establishment was challenged in all areas of society, including hockey. After the Montreal Canadiens won 5 consecutive Stanley Cups, it was obvious that the Habs had an unfair advantage over the rest of the NHL. The Montreal Canadiens claimed territorial rights to any amateur player who wanted to play organized hockey in Quebec. The road to the NHL began not with college hockey, but with junior hockey, which was comprised of various leagues of players younger than 21. Because the Canadiens sponsored and controlled all the junior teams in Quebec, anybody who played for these teams was ultimately owned by Montreal. For instance, because Jimmy Bartlett played junior hockey for Verdun in the Quebec Junior League, his rights were automatically owned by Montreal. However, in 1963, the league began to dismantle the sponsorship system. Instead, the league conducted the first NHL amateur entry draft, with each team taking turns drafting eligible players from the junior league teams. Once players are drafted, the players would continue to play junior hockey until they turned 21. However, once they turned 21, they were no longer eligible to play junior hockey. In Canada, players over 21 would then either continue to play amateur hockey or could turn professional. If they stayed amateur, they would have to play on a senior hockey team. Although they were technically classified as amateurs, they still got paid a small amount, and they would best be characterized as being semi-pro. Bartlett played senior hockey for the Matan Red Rocks. In the United States, it was a little bit different. The closest equivalent to senior hockey in the United States were the International and Eastern Leagues. Jimmy played for the Cincinnati Mohawks of the International League and the Boston Olympics of the Eastern League. In 1953, the Quebec Senior Hockey League turned professional and became the Quebec Hockey League, partly because of a fight between dueling Canadian hockey amateur associations and partly because the Canadians wanted Jean Belleville. In 1959, the NHL created the Eastern Professional Hockey League to replace the folded QHL, which became the first farm league fully owned and controlled by the NHL. This league eventually morphed into the Central Hockey League and was the lowest level of professional hockey. Jimmy played at this level for the Chicoutimi Saguines of the QHL. During the entire existence of the original six era, the second strongest hockey league was without question the American Hockey League, which had begun operations in 1936. In 1952, the amateur Pacific Coast Hockey League turned professional and became the Western Hockey League. Although initially lagging behind the AHL in quality, by the 1960s, the Western Hockey League had greatly narrowed the gap. In 1965, the two leagues played 72 competitive interleague games, with the American League winning 38 times and the Western League winning 32 times. Unlike the Central League, the American and Western League were independent leagues that competed with the NHL for players, fans, and revenue. However, both the AHL and WHL established financially beneficial working relationships with NHL clubs who would lend them players. The savings caused by not having to pay the salaries for their entire roster allowed the AHL teams to pay their own players more. Baltimore has a rich history in sports. In the 1800s, the Baltimore Orioles won 3 consecutive National League pennants and invented the Baltimore Chop, with Wee Willie Keeler hitting 'em where they ain't. It was the hometown for the most famous athlete of all time, the Bambino himself, Babe Ruth. And since 1873, Baltimore's famous Pimlico racetrack has hosted the second jewel of the Triple Crown, with legendary racehorses like Man o' War, Count Fleet, and Citation winning the Preakness Stakes. And believe it or not, the very first organized game of ice hockey ever played anywhere in the United States took place on February 22, 1893, between Yale and Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, which built the very first artificial ice rink in the entire country, named the North Avenue Ice Palace, which was located on North Avenue between Charles Street and Lovegrove Alley. But nothing gives a city status like Major League sports. And for the first half of the 20th century, Baltimore was treated like America's red-headed stepchild without any Major League teams. It was ridiculous that Boston, Philadelphia, and St. Louis each had not one, but two baseball teams, and Baltimore had none. But in the 1950s, everything would change. They didn't appear to have much in common. Mississippi-born Jake Embry was a smooth-talking radio advertising sales executive. Harvard attorney and philanthropist Zanvil Krieger was born to a wealthy Jewish family in Baltimore who had made a fortune with the Gunther Brewery. But they had three things in common. They loved Baltimore, they loved sports, and they were 100% committed to bringing Major League sports to Baltimore. In 1948, Jake Embry's Baltimore Bullets brought an NBA championship to the city, playing at the old rundown Coliseum on Monroe Street. But the Bullets were sold and then folded several years later because the Coliseum was not a suitable Major League sports venue. In 1953, Krieger and Embry were part of Carol Rosenblum's Baltimore Colts ownership group that was awarded a franchise to replace the folded Dallas Texans in the NFL. And in 1954, Krieger joined forces with Jerry Hoffberger, president of Baltimore's National Brewing Company, and invested their joint beer money to purchase the St. Louis Browns and relocated the team to a real beer town where they were renamed the Baltimore Orioles. Bringing hockey to Baltimore was next on their agenda. Although the NHL was still opposed to expansion, and Baltimore didn't have a place for the team to play anyway, in the early 60s, construction began downtown on the construction of the Baltimore Civic Center, which was built on the site of Old Congress Hall, where the Continental Congress met in 1776. Today, the site of America's first capital, Independence Hall in Philadelphia, is a national landmark, and the world's most iconic symbol of democracy is the nation's Dome Capitol building in Washington, D.C. But on the site where America's second capital stood, and where Adams, Jefferson, and Franklin met with other members of Congress after fleeing the British armies during the Revolutionary War, the city of Baltimore built a hockey rink. Now that's what you call a hockey town. In 1961, NHL President Clarence Campbell told Nate Jacobson, chairman of the Civic Center Franchise Committee, that if the league ever decided to expand, any arena must have a minimum seating capacity of 13,000. Although the Civic Center's seating capacity was less than that requirement, the city was willing to spend any reasonable amount of money needed to renovate in order to bring Major League Hockey to Baltimore. And Embry and Krieger had a plan. Step one was to obtain an American League team. On May 8, 1962, the pair reached an agreement to buy the Springfield Indians, who had just won its third consecutive Calder Cup, from Eddie Shore and relocate the team to Baltimore. But one of the AHL owners vetoed the sale. Instead, on June 13th, the league granted Baltimore a new franchise to play at the brand new Civic Center, which only had a seating capacity of 11,120 at the time. Though beneath NHL standards, it was still at the time the largest arena in the AHL. Embry was the team president, and Krieger was the chairman of the board of the Baltimore Clippers. Step 2. Make the NHL see Baltimore as an NHL caliber city by creating a major league operation, which is why they announced on July 26, 1962, that they hired 43-year-old Terry Reardon to build and run an American Hockey League team which could one day jump to the NHL. Reardon knew hockey. He wasn't a Hall of Fame caliber player like his brother Kenny, but Terry still played 193 games in the NHL as a checking forward. But Baltimore wanted Terry because of his leadership abilities. A year after winning the 1941 Stanley Cup as a 21-year-old forward, Terry helped the Allies liberate France from the Nazis as a member of Canada's armed forces, where he rose from private to captain. In 1947, Terry became the player-coach of the Providence Reds for the next 7 seasons, leading the team to the Calder Cup in 1949. coaching. After retiring as a player, he became the Reds' general manager. In 1955, he built their Calder Cup winning Providence Reds, which had been labeled the greatest team in the history of the league. Terry was given the task of creating a potential major league operation from scratch. The new team had no players, no coaches, and the season was to begin play in only 3 months. But Terry was up to the challenge. With former New York Ranger Red Sullivan as their first coach, Reardon was somehow able to put together a team. Although the teams in the AHL were independently owned and operated, the various teams entered into working agreements with the NHL clubs. When Terry coached Providence, the Reds had an agreement with the New York Rangers, but after he joined the Clippers, Baltimore replaced Providence for the team's first 5 seasons. In other words, players owned by New York who'd get cut at the Rangers training camp would be lent to the Clippers to supplement the team's roster. The Baltimore Clippers played their very first game on October 23, 1962 at the Baltimore Civic Center. In December, Clipper defenseman Aldo Guidolin replaced Sullivan and became the Clippers player coach when Red was promoted to coach the Rangers. Although the Clippers had a losing record when Guidolin took over, Baltimore caught fire under Aldo's leadership and won 8 of their final 9 games, making the playoffs in their debut season. Reardon accomplished a miracle. He created a quality team from absolute nothing, which was why in Baltimore, Terry Reardon was nicknamed Mr. Hockey. Because the Clippers' first season playing was such a success, the NBA Chicago Zephyrs announced that the team was relocating and becoming the Baltimore Bullets. When the Bullets played their very first game at the Baltimore Civic Center the following season, Baltimore had officially acquired its 3rd major league sport. But in the minds of the fans, Baltimore already had 3 major league sports because everyone in town treated the Clippers as if they were already a major league team. The Clippers received extensive coverage from the local Baltimore media. The Baltimore Sun and the News American never treated the Clippers as if they were a minor league franchise, but they gave the team the same coverage they gave the Colts, the Orioles, and the Bullets. The Clippers weren't on the back page of the newspaper, but they shared front page headlines with the other sports. The Clippers received much more coverage from the Baltimore Sun during Bartlett's time with the team than either the Rangers or Bruins did from the New York Times or Boston Globe when he was playing in the NHL. And whenever there was an event or a fundraiser involving local celebrities, it was always a Colt, an Oriole, a Bullet, and a Clipper sharing the stage together. In today's NHL, a short goal song is played whenever the home team scores. More than 50 years before Chicago Blackhawks started annoying everybody with that do-da-dee-do-da-dee-do-da-dee-do-dee-do song after every goal, the fans at the Baltimore Civic Center would enthusiastically belt down easily the greatest goal song ever written.
Win you Baltimore Clippers, win you Clippers from Baltimore, fight you Baltimore Clippers, face off, fight for a Baltimore score, defensemen, forwards, and goalie, we'll win without a doubt, for Baltimore and Maryland. Every Clipper fan will shout, fight, 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 win you Baltimore Clippers, win you Clippers from Baltimore, fight you Baltimore Clippers, and score, score, score.
The third step of Embry and Krieger's plan was to pressure the NHL into expansion. Unlike the other major leagues, the NHL did not have a national television contract. Because the league had only 6 cities concentrated only in the Northeast, the networks considered hockey to be merely a regional sport. Before agreeing to shower the NHL with TV money, the networks insisted that the league first needed to add teams on the West Coast, which meant Los Angeles and San Francisco. At the time, the Western Hockey League had teams in those cities, plus the major markets of Vancouver and Seattle. In 1965, the American Hockey League and the Western Hockey League successfully played a highly competitive interleague schedule, with the AHL winning 53% of the games. The NHL suddenly faced an imminent threat that if the AHL and the WHL officially merged, they could declare themselves a second major league with teams on both coasts and grab that coveted TV money. In June 1965, the NHL president, Clarence Campbell, announced that the league was going to expand to 12 teams beginning in 1967 and entertain pitches from various ownership groups. Krieger said that the NHL had 3 criteria that needed to be met to make a city acceptable. 1, a $2 million entry fee that Krieger said he was going to pay. 2, a proven ownership group that they obviously had. And 3, an arena with adequate seating. According to Krieger, the NHL approved the Baltimore Clippers in every way for expansion, except the Civic Center still needed to add 2,000 seats before the 1967 season began. On October 1st, architects and engineers developed a remodeling plan to allow the Baltimore Civic Center to meet the NHL seating requirements. The league also found Los Angeles and St. Louis to be acceptable. The press predicted that LA, St. Louis, Baltimore, Oakland, Minnesota, and either Vancouver or Pittsburgh would be awarded the NHL franchises. However, this meeting wasn't official. Instead, in February 1966, the league listened to presentations from 14 different ownership groups making pitches, now including ones from Cleveland, Buffalo, and a last-minute bid from Philadelphia. St. Louis's expansion bid ran into serious trouble. The rink was in the process of being condemned by the city for urban renewal, and they never even sent a representative to the meeting to make a bid. Krieger, the Harvard-trained lawyer, knew how to make a presentation. Baltimore already had 3 major league sports and was a major league city in every conceivable way. Baltimore had the 6th largest television market in the country. In each year of the team's existence, the extremely popular Clippers led the league in gate receipts. Plus, an NHL team would draw crowds from Washington, D.C. On February 10, 1966, the NHL president, Clarence Campbell, announced the 6 cities that were awarded NHL franchises: Los Angeles, Oakland, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and last but not least, St. Louis. However, Campbell added that if any of the cities were unable to demonstrate an ability to comply by April, then Baltimore would automatically replace that team. To say that Baltimore was pissed off by being treated like the first runner-up in some beauty pageant would be an understatement. It was almost inconceivable that Baltimore was denied a team. Pittsburgh, Philly, and St. Louis all had NHL teams prior to the original 6 era, and they all folded due to lack of fan support. The Minneapolis team in the Central League was so financially unstable they had to borrow money from the league, and the Boston Bruins had just dumped them as their foreign club due to lack of fan support. Sure, the Baltimore Civic Center needed to add some seats, but Pittsburgh's rink had even less seats. Oakland's arena was still only half built, and Philadelphia and Minneapolis both had to build entirely new arenas to meet league requirements. But what upset Baltimore the most was that St. Louis was awarded a franchise when no ownership group ever sent a representative to even make a bid. However, the owners of the Chicago Blackhawks also happened to own the old rundown St. Louis arena, and one of the conditions for operating a team in St. Louis was that the new ownership groups would also have to buy the worthless arena for $4 million. The fix was in, and Baltimore got screwed. On February 12, 1966, the NHL for Baltimore Committee requested the chairman of the United States Congressional Judiciary Committee to conduct an investigation as to why Baltimore was denied a team even though they met all qualifications, and why teams which did not meet qualifications made the league. Meanwhile, the Clippers had their worst season since joining the league, missing the playoffs. As a result, Reardon terminated Johnny Crawford as coach of the club. When Bartlett was owned by the Rangers, he was lent to the Providence Reds in 1955, where the Calder Cup winning team had Johnny Crawford as their coach and Terry Reardon as their general manager. The same Terry Reardon who brought Bartlett back to Rhode Island when he bought him from the Boston Bruins in 1961. On June 23, 1966, after Reardon was advised by a Rangers executive for the Clippers to stock up on their own players to prepare for the effects of NHL expansion, Reardon traded for seasoned veterans Aldo Guidolin, Willie Marshall, and Jimmy Bartlett. Reardon didn't replace Crawford but assumed coaching duties for the upcoming season. According to the Clippers trainer, Gump Embro, there was nothing fancy about Terry. He smoked nickel cigars, shot, and a beer. Tough Irishman. He was great at putting a team together, getting players with a year or two left, former NHL guys. He'd take 8 or 9 old guys like that, put them with some young guys, and have a great team. Basically, there were two types of Clippers: those whose rights were owned by New York and who were lent or assigned to the Clippers but were subject to call up to the Rangers, and those players who were owned outright by the Baltimore Clippers. When Jimmy played for the Providence Reds in the 50s, his contract was owned by New York until his rights were poached by Boston in the 1960 draft. Ironically, if Jimmy had never been poached by the Bruins, he would have remained the property of the Rangers and probably would have eventually ended up in Baltimore anyway. But with one major difference: Bartlett was now one of those players who was owned by the Clippers. No matter how well Bartlett played, he would not be returning to Broadway. In 1966, the most popular Baltimore player was the Silver Fox, Sandy McGregor. Sandy was known as the original Clipper and had been with the team since its 1962 league debut, when he scored 21 goals as a rookie winger. Like Bartlett, Sandy used to be owned by the Rangers. After scoring 24 goals in 1964, Sandy was part of the trade with the Rangers that sent Guidolin and Plager to the Reds in exchange for Eddie Giacomin. But Sandy flat out refused to report to Providence. So Reardon swung a deal with the Reds, and Baltimore obtained his contract. After a poor 1965 season due to a hand injury, Sandy began the 66 year fighting for a roster spot because during the offseason, Reardon had not only traded for Bartlett and Willie Marshall, he was also able to poach two forwards in the AHL's intra-league draft. The AHL and the NHL had negotiated for the creation of a two-way draft, which allowed American Hockey League teams to draft or poach the rights of non-protected NHL players and vice versa. Rensselaer Polytech Institute is a small private college in Troy, New York. The White Knight Bob Brinkworth was a two-time All-American forward at RPI, leading the obscure school to the semifinals in the 1964 NCAA National Hockey Championship. After graduating, he turned pro with the Omaha Knights, where he played for one season. In 1965, he joined the Rhode Island Reds, where he was a teammate with Bartlett and scored 11 goals. Brinkworth was poached by Terry Reardon in the league's 1966 reverse draft because he was impressed that Brinkworth was a speedy and shifty hustler with a dangerous left-hand shot, but was concerned that the studious player had a reputation of being too light and fragile. Reardon also drafted a 6'1" playmaking center Bob Cunningham, who according to Terry had good skating form and classy passing ability, but would get too fancy at times and was often too hesitant to shoot the puck. This would be Cunningham's second stint with the team. Like McGregor, Cunny used to be owned by the Rangers and played for the Clippers in their very first season. But in 1963, he was sent down to the Central League for a couple of years, and his rights were later sold to the Detroit Red Wings before being poached by the Clippers. Returning to the Clippers was veteran French left winger Jean-Marie Cossette. The tough-checking and speedy Cossette began his professional career in the Quebec Hockey League, playing for the Quebec Aces from 1954 until 1958. When the Aces jumped to the American League in 1959, Cossette remained with the club for another 4 years, scoring 26 goals in 1960. In 1963 and 64, Cossette played for the Seattle Totems of the Western League. In 1965, after being poached by Reardon in that season's reverse draft, Cossette scored 27 goals while spending only 8 minutes in the sin bin and was named the team's most valuable Clipper. When Jimmy arrived in Baltimore for Providence to begin the season, he moved into a 3-bedroom apartment in Loch Raven with his new teammate Duncan MacDonald. When I was a teenager, I had curly hair, and my dad used to tell me not to comb my hair, but just mess it up a bit with my hands and then pat it down, like he said Duncan MacDonald used to do. To this day, I still have no idea why my dad thought Duncan MacDonald had such cool hair, or why he wanted me to do my hair like Duncan MacDonald. The young winger was probably the fastest player on the team and also probably had the hardest shot. And he was poached by Reardon in the same reverse draft as Cossette. But he was sidelined at the beginning of the season because of a knee surgery, which unfortunately would bother him for the rest of his career. Of course, Terry Reardon had also just acquired a pair of 34-year-old forwards, Jimmy Bartlett and Willie Marshall, in the June trade with the Providence Reds. The great Willie Marshall had previously led the Pittsburgh Hornets to the Calder Cup in 1954, before leading the league in scoring and winning back-to-back championships with Hershey in 1958 and 59. But Marshall's productivity had dropped off significantly as a member of Providence, with Willie scoring only 12 goals in 1964 and 13 goals in 1965. Most Clipper fans at the time assumed that the two old veteran forwards were washed up and were just thrown in as a bonus for the real prize of the trade, defenseman Aldo Guidolin. The Baltimore Sun wrote that Bartlett still has a good right hook, but punches don't win hockey games. On the other hand, Aldo had previously been the Clippers' star player coach in the first 3 years of the team's existence before being sent to Providence in the Jockeman trade. Most assumed that Aldo would once again coach the club in 1966, but Reardon didn't want Guidolin distracted, so Reardon himself assumed coaching duties for the team. Instead, he wanted Guidolin to concentrate on his role as a tough, hard-hitting defenseman. Although Aldo was a complete gentleman off the ice, he had no problem with protecting his goalie by any means necessary, which was why the notoriously dirty Larry Zeidel was the only defenseman at that time to have spent more time in the penalty box in his AHL career than Aldo Guidolin. Baltimore had also obtained the versatile Eddie MacQueen the previous season in a trade with the Reds. MacQueen had spent 4 seasons as a teammate of Bartlett, where he was used as the ultimate utility player on both defense and on the right wing. With the Clippers, Eddie was primarily used as a winger. The Clippers also had acquired the rights to one of the greatest hockey players who ever lived, Doug Harvey. Whenever I would ask my dad who he would put on his all-time team, at defense it was always Bobby Orr and Doug Harvey. According to Bartlett, Harvey was easily the greatest defenseman he ever played against. Doug Harvey won 7 Norris trophies as the NHL's best defenseman and quarterbacked the most dominant power play in history, leading the Montreal Canadiens of the 50s to 5 consecutive Stanley Cups. But Doug Harvey was now ancient at 41 years old and had been playing in the American League since 1963. And although still very skilled, Harvey's age and his reputation for abusing alcohol caused serious concerns for the team's management. Joining the Clippers just before the start of the season began, following a trade with Hershey, was 25-year-old defenseman Nick Polano. Polano had been the Bears' policeman the previous season, leading the team in penalty minutes. The Clippers could always depend on the very reliable Gilles Boisvert. Boisvert played juniors against Bartlett and was the goalie for Three Rivers in the game when Talbot controversially injured Scotty Bowman. In 1955, immediately after his rights were acquired by Boston, Boisvert was traded to the Detroit Red Wings organization, which was at the time part of the largest exchange of players in a single trade in NHL history and included Hall of Fame goalie Terry Sawchuk. Gilles had his greatest success playing for Chicoutimi in the Quebec Hockey League and the Edmonton Flyers in the Western League. In 1959, Boisvert started 3 games in the NHL for the Red Wings and then returned to the minor leagues. Gilles became a Clipper in 1963 and was nicknamed Teddy Bear. However, the only name I remember my dad ever calling him was Boxy, and he was used primarily as the team's backup goalie. Because of this, he only dressed in cases of emergency and spent most of the time watching the game and socializing in the stands. Boxy knew everyone in Baltimore where he lived for the rest of his life. When I was a kid, I remember thinking he was rich because while the rest of the team lived in apartments, Gilles had his own house and it had a swimming pool. It seemed that every year, Gilles would retire and then the Clippers would get hit with an emergency and Reardon would convince Boisvert to unretire. And Boxy never disappointed, always ready in a pinch. Boisvert became a successful local businessman and the last member of the Clippers to live in the Baltimore area, where he remained a beloved member of the community for the rest of his life. A great ambassador to the game, Gilles Boisvert managed Baltimore's Inner Harbor rink, where he taught children how to skate. Baltimore Clippers roster also contained plenty of talent that was owned by the New York Rangers. The Clippers captain was Bartlett's old teammate from his Ranger days, Kenny Schinkel. Schinkel found great success in Baltimore after New York assigned him to Baltimore in 1963. Kenny twice scored 30 goals for the Clippers and had led the team in scoring the previous season. At left wing, the Clippers had 6'2" Doug Robinson, who had originally been part of the Blackhawks organization. In 1962, Robinson won the American Hockey League's Rookie of the Year and was named the second-team All-Star after he scored 36 goals and helped lead the Buffalo Bisons to the Calder Cup when he was only 22 years old. In February 1965, midway into his NHL debut season with the Blackhawks, Chicago traded Robinson to the Rangers in a deal for Camille Henry. After scoring 8 goals in 51 games with the Rangers the previous year, they lent him to the Baltimore Clippers to begin the new season. When he was only 22 years old, Bill Knibbs was the third-line center for the 1964-65 Boston Bruins. But after Milt Schmidt's team once again finished in last place, Knibbs was placed on waivers and he was selected by the Rangers, who assigned him to Baltimore. In 1965, during his first year with the Clippers, Knibbs scored 21 goals. Playing on Knibbs' line at right wing was a 23-year-old rugged rookie forward named Billy Collins, who had played the previous 2 seasons with the Rangers' Minnesota affiliate in the Central Pro Hockey League. In 1956, defenseman Ron Ingram was enjoying his rookie season with the Chicago Blackhawks when the team sold him to the Cleveland Barons of the AHL near the end of the year. The late addition to the team helped lead the Barons to that year's Calder Cup. In 1957, Ron joined the Buffalo Bisons, where he starred on the blue line for the next 6 seasons, winning a second league championship in 1963. After he was traded to Detroit the following year, Ingram was back in the NHL as a Red Wing, but he was traded once again near the end of the season, but this time to the Rangers, who in 1964 lent the veteran defenseman to the Baltimore Clippers. The probable inspiration for the Hanson brothers in the movie Slapshot were the 3 sons of Gus Plager. Gus was nicknamed Squirrel because he raised 3 nuts. When the 3 Plager brothers were growing up, they would settle arguments by putting on boxing gloves and beating the hell out of each other, with their dad serving as referee. The 3 brawling Plager brothers were all defensemen who were destined to one day play together in the NHL. But in 1966, while younger brother Billy was playing for Houston in the Central League, and big brother Barkley was in his 3rd season with the rival Springfield Indians, 23-year-old Bobby Plager was linked to the Baltimore Clippers by the New York Rangers. Bobby previously played 19 games for Baltimore in 1964 before he was sent to the Vancouver Canucks of the Western League, where he received 103 penalty minutes in only 31 games. In 1965, Plager played 18 games for the Rangers, but spent the majority of the season with New York's Central League affiliate in St. Paul. The pairing of Plager and Polano on the Clippers was nicknamed the Bomb Squad. During the season, Plager was scouted by the rookie coach of the expansion St. Louis Blues, Scotty Bowman, who observed that Plager was more than just a tough guy, he was a good hockey player. Returning to the Clippers was their former starting goalie, the quiet and reserved Gilles Villemure. In 1962, Villemure was assigned to the Vancouver Canucks by the Rangers, where he won the Western Hockey League's Rookie of the Year. He played 66 games as the Clippers' starting goalie in 1963, but the Rangers sent him back to Vancouver for 2 more seasons. Gilles had an outstanding 65-66 year when he led the Western League with 5 shutouts and was named to the league's first All-Star team. It didn't take long for Bartlett to make an impression on his new teammates or with the press. The Baltimore Sun described Jimmy's first training camp with his new team. Bartlett, an antagonist who precipitates fights, was exceptionally active in the double drills. His use of elbows and cross-checks provoked mild repercussions from teammates, and Bartlett himself, following the second drill, commented, "It looks as if we'll have a lot more exciting team this year if I have anything to do with it." By the mid-'60s, the city of Baltimore had become the center of the sports universe. Don Shula's Baltimore Colts were led by the game's greatest quarterback, Johnny Unitas, and finished either first or second in their conference for 8 consecutive seasons. Between 1964 and 1970, the Baltimore Colts won more games than even the Green Bay Packers. And Unitas was the perfect working-class hero for Baltimore. Johnny U was never a blue-chip prospect. He was a blue-collar quarterback. The unsigned 9th-round draft pick, who was thought to be too skinny for the NFL, was playing semi-pro ball for the Bloomfield Rams for $6 a game when he was rescued off the scrap heap of obscurity by the Colts. On the baseball diamond, the 1966 Baltimore Orioles won the pennant, while the Goliath of baseball, the New York Yankees, finished dead last. Unlike the Yankees dynasty of the early 60s, which was based on the shoulders of the power-hitting megastar Mickey Mantle, the blue-collar Orioles' success was based on team defense, with Brooks Robinson, Paul Blair, and Louis Aparicio combining for 26 Gold Gloves while playing for the O's. What put the Birds over the top in 1966, though, was baseball's most famous trade since the Red Sox traded away the Babe. The Orioles traded away their 27-year-old pitcher, Milt Pappas, and two other players to the Cincinnati Reds. Pappas was a three-time All-Star who won 110 games for the Orioles and had finished the season as the club's top starting pitcher with a 13-9 record and a 2.60 ERA. 5 months before the Baltimore Clippers acquired Willie Marshall and Jimmy Bartlett from the Providence Reds, two veterans who were thought of being washed up, the Orioles similarly acquired a 30-year-old outfielder from the Cincinnati Reds who many thought was past his prime. His name was Frank Robinson. In his first season with the Orioles, F. Robbie won the Triple Crown, leading the American League with a .316 average, 49 home runs, and 122 RBIs. When Robinson was awarded the league MVP award, he became the first player in Major League Baseball history to earn MVP honors in both the American and National Leagues. On October 9, 1966, the Baltimore Orioles sent Sandy Koufax into retirement when the Baltimore Orioles swept the glamorous Los Angeles Dodgers in 4 straight, winning Baltimore's first ever World Series. After scoring only 19 goals in his final season with the Providence Reds, before the season began, Bartlett vowed to score at least 20 with the Clippers. When Bartlett was traded to Baltimore by the Reds, it was the only time in his career that he was ever traded, and it pissed him off. During his time playing with Baltimore, Jimmy did everything in his power to punish Providence for their betrayal. As a Clipper, Jimmy would eventually score more goals against Providence than any other team. Jimmy played his first game as a Baltimore Clipper on October 14, 1966, in a road game against Providence. In his Clippers debut, the Baltimore Sun referred to Bartlett as a former Baltimore villain on whom the spotlight seems to shine whenever he's on the ice. For the season opener, Coach Reardon let loose on Providence a line comprised solely of former Providence Reds members, Marshall, Bartlett, and Eddie MacQueen. In the first period, MacQueen scored the game's first goal with an assist from Jimmy, but Eddie Couture tied the game for the Reds in the second. Bartlett raised his stick with glee when he broke the 1-1 deadlock when he connected with a 12-footer against old friend Marcel Paillet for the game winner in the game's final 6 minutes with assists from Marshall and MacQueen. Reardon intended for Willie Marshall to center the team's top line with Jean-Marie Cossette and Kenny Schinkel on his wings. However, after being the team's MVP the season before, Cossette went into a season-long slump, scoring only 8 goals. Instead, Reardon replaced Cossette on the top line with Doug Robinson, and the line quickly developed into one of the AHL's most dominant forces that year. Bartlett started on the second line, centered by Cunningham with MacQueen on the other wing. But after Eddie injured his knee, Sandy McGregor eventually took his place on the line. Knibbs centered the checking line with Brinkworth and Collins. On November 15, 1966, the Clippers returned to Baltimore after winning 3 consecutive games on the road, with Jimmy scoring in each of those games. However, a month into the season, Jimmy still hadn't scored in front of the Baltimore hometown fans. The Clippers were trailing 3-0 against Buffalo in the second period, but after Marshall and Schinkel each scored to close the gap, Bart scored the tying goal with helpers from Sandy McGregor and Aldo Guidolin. According to the papers, he celebrated his goal with a toe dance that would have made Pavlova blush. Jimmy and Willie each scored a second time in the Clippers' 6-4 comeback victory for Baltimore's 5th consecutive win. After the game, the Baltimore Sun wrote that Jimmy would never admit it, but he dallied long after the game, likely waiting for reporters to enter. "I told you guys that was for real," Bartlett said after the game. "You guys didn't believe me. I hope you're satisfied, but don't forget about my friend that I brought along with me. You guys know Willie, don't you?" This began the Baltimore's press love affair with Jimmy Bartlett. From that moment on, nobody on the Clippers appeared in the newspapers more than Bartlett. Bartlett loved the spotlight, and award-winning journalists Al Fisher of the Baltimore Sun and George Taylor of the News American couldn't get enough of the endlessly quotable Jimmy Bartlett. Prior to the Clippers' next game, the modest, unassuming Bartlett not only promised a 6th straight win, he promised to score the winning goal. Living up to his word, the Clippers defeated Providence 4-1 before the largest home crowd of the season. Seiling, McGregor, and Willie Marshall each scored, but Bartlett scored twice, including the promised game winner, and picked up an assist. Jimmy had scored a goal in each of the team's last 5 games with 3 game winners. With Bartlett having scored 7 goals in 5 games and Willie tearing it up on the top line, the Baltimore press called the Clippers' preseason trade for Bartlett and Marshall to be Baltimore's biggest coup since the Orioles acquired Frank Robinson. On November 26, Billy Collins scored at 7:05 in the second period to give the Clippers a 3-2 lead over the Quebec Aces. Then came the brawl. Bartlett and Quebec's defenseman Ray LaRose threw heavy punches at each other at center ice, with Ron Ingram fighting Kiki Mortson in the background. All 4 of them were sent off with 5-minute majors, but Bartlett also simultaneously picked up an additional high-sticking major for drawing blood and a 10-minute misconduct for a whooping 20 penalty minutes in Baltimore's 9-3 blowout victory. On December 4th, Gilles Villemure had his 3rd shutout of the season in the Clippers' 6-0 blowout over the Providence Reds. 12 seconds before the end of the game, Bartlett decided to punish his old team once again when he fought the Roosters' Ed Lawson, resulting in a near free-for-all, with the referee having an exceptionally difficult time restraining Bartlett in order to restore the peace. Why Ed Lawson? Payback. He was one of the guys the Reds received from Baltimore when Rhode Island committed the mortal sin of trading away Jimmy Bartlett. On December 18th, despite a second-period goal by Bartlett, the Clippers lost to the Calder Cup defending Rochester Americans, with Jimmy's former teammate from Chicoutimi, Stan Smirk, getting the hat trick. After scoring, Bartlett taunted Rochester goalie Bobby Perreault. "Didn't see that one, huh?" After yelling at each other in French, Perreault skated out of the net and smacked Bartlett in the forehead with his goalie stick. Jimmy immediately dropped the gloves and punched Perreault so hard in the face that it knocked him 8 feet back into the net, causing his face to swell up like an apple. Bartlett and Perreault previously fought 16 years earlier when they both were still teenagers playing junior hockey. Bartlett with the Verdun LaSalles and Perreault sharing goaltending duties with Boisvert and Three Rivers. Unfortunately, Jimmy broke his hand on Perreault's head, which caused him to miss the next 5 games. Bartlett played against Perreault for his entire career. In Bartlett's first year as a professional, he played for the Chicoutimi Saguins of the Quebec Hockey League, which was eliminated in the playoffs that year by the Shawnigan Falls Cats that starred the QHL's goalie of the year, Bob Perreault. Perreault was a Hershey Bears starting goalie from 1956 to 1962 for 5 seasons, winning 2 consecutive Calder Cups. After a couple years playing for San Francisco in the Western League, Perreault returned to the American League in 1965 and would win 2 more Calder Cup championships in the net for the Rochester Amerks. He was named the second-team All-Star 4 times and was inducted into the AHL Hall of Fame in 2013. On December 23rd, the Rangers lent to the Clippers the 21-year-old defenseman Ron Seiling. Far from inexperienced, Seiling already had played 2 full seasons in the NHL for the Rangers and even played for Team Canada as a teenager against the Soviets in the '64 Winter Olympics. More known for his defensive game than for his offense, he was more of a finesse-type defenseman than a heavy banger like Plager. At the time, he was thought of as the Rangers' top prospect, with head coach Emile Francis forecasting that he had the potential to become even as great as the legend himself, Doug Harvey. But when the Rangers sent the Clippers Seiling, the Clippers were forced to get rid of one of their defensemen to make room for him on the roster. So Terry Reardon sold Doug Harvey to the Providence Reds. But Harvey found a loophole in his contract and declared himself a free agent. Refusing to report to the Reds, Harvey instead signed a contract with the Detroit Red Wings, who then sent him to the Pittsburgh Hornets for the rest of the season. After a year as the player-coach of the Kansas City Blues of the Central Hockey League, Harvey was back in the NHL for one final season playing for the St. Louis Blues, and reuniting him with his old Montreal teammate Jacques Plante. Sadly, Harvey battled alcoholism and bipolar disorder for the remainder of his life, spending his final years living in a railroad car at a racetrack in Quebec. On January 6, 1967, the Clippers beat the Quebec Aces 3-2 with a goal by Bartlett. It was Jimmy's first game back after breaking his hand. Doug Robinson would miss the next 3 games with a groin pull, and Bartlett would get to play with Willie and Schinkel on the top line. Although not fully healed, Bartlett didn't want to miss any more games, so he took off the cast and just wrapped his hand with extra ace bandages. A simple thing like a broken metacarpal bone wasn't going to stop Jimmy Bartlett from seeking the limelight. Bartlett always used to tell stories about the various ways he escaped death. I remember once when he matter-of-factly told me about the time he survived a plane crash. I called bullshit, so my dad went up to the attic, and after searching around through the scrapbooks, he eventually reemerged downstairs with the proof. After the game, the team chartered a 40-passenger plane for a midnight flight to Cleveland, where they were scheduled to play the next evening. The small plane was buffeted by high winds throughout the flight. When approaching the airport prior to landing, the plane's landing equipment malfunctioned and got stuck in the up position, so the pilot was forced to land the plane on its belly without any landing gear. The sliding plane finally stopped about 10 feet off the runway after the pilot steered it off the runway to cut down on sparks. Thank God nobody was injured in the crash. The stress of the plane crash did not prevent the Clippers from whipping the Barons that night 6-2, with Bartlett scoring the team's first goal of the night and once again exchanging punches with Cleveland's Fred Glover. Without a plane, the Clippers were forced to travel by bus for their next game in Rochester, where Jimmy scored for the 3rd straight game. When the Clippers returned to Baltimore, a healthy Doug Robinson returned to the top Marshall line, and an injury to Sidney McGregor forced Reardon to put Jimmy on the 3rd line with Billy Knibbs and Billy Collins. Bartlett scored 2 goals in the team's win against Providence on January 10, 1967. When asked by the press after the game how it felt playing on the 3rd line, Bartlett answered that he considered any line that he was playing on to be the number 1 line. "When I'm on the ice, I'm as good as anyone else, and my line is as good as any other. So who goes by numbers on lines?" After scoring goals in the next 2 games, which the team won against Buffalo and Cleveland, Jimmy's 6-game goal-scoring streak ended on January 15, 1967, when the Clippers tied the Bisons 5-5. Not too shabby while playing with a broken hand. Baltimore was a city of working-class underdogs. No sporting moment to capture the mood of the city more than a famous match race between the People's Horse, Seabiscuit, and the seemingly invincible War Admiral that occurred on November 1st, 1938. 40,000 fans packed the infield and 40 million Americans listened on the radio as Seabiscuit proved to be a symbol of hope to many Americans during the Great Depression, as the undersized thoroughbred that was bought for only $8,000 beat the Triple Crown winner at Pimlico Racetrack in Baltimore. The rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air illuminated the city of Baltimore when Americans stationed at Fort McHenry successfully stopped the British invasion and inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner. Nothing better expresses the spirit of Baltimore than that image of those scrappy underdogs refusing to quit fighting no matter how overwhelming the odds or the size of their opponent. Despite having one of the best seasons in Clippers history, Doug Robinson wasn't popular at all with the Baltimore fans. They didn't want Ned Braden. They wanted scrappy fighters. The Baltimore fans preferred the brawling, hard-hitting bone crushers, or as Don Cherry used to call them, rock and sock 'em hockey. Fighters, players like Bobby Plager and Jimmy Bartlett. On January 15, 1967, the NFL's Green Bay Packers defeated the AFL's Kansas City Chiefs 35-10 in the first AFL-NFL World Championship game, which is now known as Super Bowl I. About a third of the seats remained empty at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. On January 17th, Bartlett and Larry Zeidel mixed things up midway through the final period, with Bartlett almost taking the Cleveland defenseman's head off with a vicious stick swipe after Zeidel had put an unnecessary trip on the Clipper left winger. Playing in his final season with the Cleveland Barons was the right winger, Ron Atwell. When Atwell and Bartlett were both AHL rookies, they were teammates on the 1955 Calder Cup winning Providence Reds. But Atwell was only 20 and needed more development, so he returned to the QHL for several years. But after scoring 20 goals with the Western League's Spokane Aces in 1959, Atwell joined the Cleveland Barons in 1960, where he won his second Calder Cup in 1963 and notched 20 goals on 5 different occasions. At the age of 32, Ron would finally make the NHL in 1967 when he was sold to the St. Louis Blues, but would be back in the American League after playing only 22 games. In his final season in the AHL, Atwell would win the Calder Cup for the third time in 1970, skating for the Buffalo Bisons. On January 20th, with the Clippers leading 2-1 at the Civic Center, Springfield pulled their goalie in the final minute for an additional attacker. Bartlett took a pass from Cunningham and skated in all alone in front of the empty net. But instead of tapping in the game-clinching goal, Bartlett suddenly stopped skating 4 feet in front of the net, dramatically looked up at the scoreboard and the clock ticking down, and simply stayed there playing with the puck, taunting the Indians. When 6'4" defenseman Dale Rolfe saw what Bartlett was doing, he started skating towards him like a freight train ready to pulverize him. But a moment before Jimmy's scout got whacked by Rolfe's swinging stick, Jimmy somehow ducked out of the way. A moment after tapping the puck into the net, with Rolfe flying over him and crashing into the boards. While Rolfe was penalized for high sticking and Springfield's Mike Corbett was given a misconduct when he protested the referee's call, the Baltimore fans loved watching Bartlett rub salt into Springfield's wounds as the team moved into second place. Channeling Nostradamus once again before the February 10th Clippers game against the first-place Hershey Bears, Bartlett promised the press that he would score Baltimore's first and last goals in the victory. Well, he lived up to half of that promise, because at 4:57 in the first period, he refused to be taken off the crease and he deflected a shot past Hershey's goalie Andre Gill. Doug Robinson scored the final Clipper goal, however, when he scored an empty netter for a hat trick in Baltimore's 5-3 victory over Hershey. On February 12, 1967, Fred Glover, the player-coach of the Cleveland Barons, became the first player in AHL history to score 500 goals in his career. When Glover retired in 1968 to become the coach of the NHL's Oakland Seals, he was the AHL's all-time leader in games played, goals, assists, points, and penalty minutes. On February 17th, the Clippers lost their captain, Ken Schinkel, when he was called up by the Rangers, where he would remain for the balance of the season. He would never play another game with Baltimore. After the season, Schinkel would be poached by the Pittsburgh Penguins in the NHL's first expansion draft, where he would play for 6 seasons, twice playing in the NHL's All-Star Game. The Clippers named defenseman Bobby Plager the new team captain. According to the Baltimore Sun, Jimmy Bartlett was a fighter, a showman, and a leader. Even though Plager was now the new captain of the team, Jimmy was dubbed by his teammates as the leader. Actually, he more or less appointed himself in that role, and the rest of the team just accepted it. I try to get him up for the games. A team needs a leader, and the guys seem to like the way I talk and act before games. Baltimore was also a city that admired the eccentric over the mainstream. It was the home of the master of the macabre, Edgar Allan Poe, as well as the birthplace of the eclectic musician Frank Zappa and the proudly trashy independent filmmaker John Waters. Baltimore also loved their colorful sports heroes, like the larger-than-life Colts defensive tackle Artie Donovan, or Earl Weaver, the feisty little manager of the Orioles, kicking dirt at home plate umpires. Bartlett fit right in. Jimmy was also a leader on the team when it came to practical jokes. According to Guidolin, Bartlett used to stand on the roof and shovel snow onto people standing below. When the team would be at the airport, his favorite gag was to tie a $20 bill to a string and leave it on the ground while he would be hiding behind the corner. When some unsuspecting person would spot it and bend over to pick it up, Jimmy would quickly pull the string to their surprise, at which point the mocking laughter would then begin. According to Guidolin, Jimmy would entertain the fans in Providence by climbing up on the screen behind the net whenever he scored a goal. In Providence, the press referred to it as the Irish jig, but in Baltimore, they called it the Cassius Clay Shuffle, which was described as a little dance on tiptoes with his arms raised. More than 100 members of the city and state legislature witnessed Bartlett put on a one-man show on February 21st, when in the first period, Jimmy scored twice and assisted on a beautiful goal by Cunningham in the Clippers' win against the Buffalo Bisons. To replace Schinkel, the Rangers lent the Clippers former Montreal Canadian Billy Hickey. In his 7 years in the NHL before joining the Clippers, veteran winger Billy Hickey had won 2 Stanley Cups with the Canadiens, where he had scored 20 goals in 1961. Hickey had previously led the American League in scoring in 1958 when he was with the Rochester Amerks. However, when he was traded in '64, his production and ice time dropped considerably. In the first 48 games of the season, Hickey had scored only 3 times. After sulking in New York about his reassignment for about a week, Hickey finally reported to Baltimore, where he made his debut with the Clippers on February 24, 1967, in a game against the Hershey Bears that Terry Reardon called the most important game of the season. Hickey took out his anger about his demotion by dropping the mitts against Hershey defenseman Ralph Keller within the game's first 3 minutes. The Clippers prevailed 4-2 with Bartlett and Cunningham both scoring and assisting on each other's goals. While playing on the top line with Marshall and Robinson, Hickey would refine his scoring touch, connecting an amazing 14 times in only 18 games with the Clippers. On February 26, the Clippers were in Providence, which allowed Jimmy the opportunity to spend some time with Melinda and JJ, who continued to live with their mother Helen in New England. I don't know for sure whether having to say goodbye to the kids caused Jimmy to play with so much anger in his games when playing in Providence, or if it was just payback for trading him, but whenever the Clippers played in Providence, Jimmy played very emotionally. According to the Baltimore Sun, it was a rough and wide-open game with Jimmy Bartlett having a stormy night of it with his rough tactics. Bartlett, seemingly determined on showing up his old mates, played it rough from the start. But it wasn't until the final period that developments came. First, he roughed up Bob Leduc and slammed him against the nets. Then he made a wild rush at Ken Stevenson after the latter had dropped him with a wild charge. Stevenson, of course, was the other guy who Providence obtained in the trade for Bartlett. Two days later, the Clippers played the Reds again, but this time back in Baltimore. The Baltimore Sun, noting how Bartlett takes ever-increasing pleasure in dishing out punishment to his ex-mates, wrote before the game that Bartlett promised that he intended to dish out the punishment by scoring tonight, which of course he did, beating Marcel Paillet in Baltimore's 8-5 win for his 28th goal of the season. The most goals Jimmy had previously scored in a year was 31 in 1961, and with 14 games left to play, Bartlett was on pace to easily beat his personal best season. Most reviews of Jimmy's career have commented on his steady consistency, and that's because he scored between 20 to 30 goals every year like clockwork. But if you look at Jimmy's career in detail, the only thing that was consistent about Bartlett was his inconsistency, which frustrated all of his coaches. Throughout his career, the press always referred to Jimmy as being very moody. He was an incredibly streaky player, scoring most of his goals in bunches. When he was on fire, Bartlett was an unstoppable dynamo, a goal-scoring machine. But when he wasn't on fire, he was as cold as the ice beneath his skates. After scoring his 28th goal of the season against Providence on February 28th, Jimmy inexplicably lost the magic in his stick and would fail to score in any of the Clippers' next 10 games. Bart finally broke out of his slump when he finally scored his 29th goal against Ross Brooks on March 26 in a game against the Providence Reds after a desperate Reardon experimented by putting Jimmy on a line centered by defenseman Ron Seiling with Eddie MacQueen on the other wing. With one game remaining in the season against Hershey, Terry Reardon was a favorite for winning the league's Coach of the Year for molding a team labeled as too old into the playoffs. According to the Baltimore Sun, Reardon had done a tremendous reclamation job on Bartlett, who lapses into moods on many occasions. Those moods haven't been as frequent this year. Villemure shut out the Hershey Bears 5-0 in a bruising, bloody, tight-checking season finale, despite suffering a cut on the head with 6 minutes left, requiring repairs in the dressing room. Guidolin also took a deflected puck to the forehead that required 15 stitches to close. In the first minute of the game, Bartlett entertained the Clippers fans when he dropped the mitts against defenseman Mike Mahoney and was sent off with a 5-minute major, and Plager did likewise in the second period when he squared off against former Clipper Pete Ford. With the Clippers leading 2-0 to start the third period, Bartlett and Hickey teamed up for Baltimore's third goal, which came at 2:04 of the finale, with Bartlett tucking home his 30th of the season from just outside the crease after Hickey had fired the puck around the net. 3 minutes later, Doug Robinson broke Gordon Labossiere's Clippers record when he scored his 39th goal of the season. The game was also the final regular season game of Hershey defenseman Yowie Janasic's long hockey career. After playing several years in the Western League, Janasic joined the Bears in 1957, where he played more than 600 games over the next 10 seasons. Janasic was a teammate of Willie Marshall on Hershey's 58-59 Calder Cup team and was named the second-team All-Star after the 1960 season. As a result of Terry Reardon's preseason trade for Marshall, Bartlett, and Guidolin, the Clippers finished the 66-67 season in second place in the Eastern Division behind the Hershey Bears with 80 points, a 24-point improvement from the previous season. Willie Marshall finished the season with 33 goals while leading the team in scoring with a new Clippers record 89 points, which was third overall in the league. His line mate Doug Robinson led the team with 39 goals. And late season addition Billy Hickey at right wing had an amazing 14 goals and 14 assists while playing in only 18 games with Baltimore. Rookie Billy Collins not only scored 20 goals playing on the third line, but he tied the club record with 8 game winners. Bob Cunningham had the best season of his career with 52 points and 17 goals. 23-year-old Warrior Bobby Plager led the American League with 169 penalty minutes. And goalie Gilles Villemure had an outstanding year, being named the league's second-team All-Star goalie, winning 34 games with 4 shutouts. On the other hand, Sandy McGregor had his second subpar year in a row, scoring only 12 goals, and the year after being named the most valuable Clipper, Cossette had the worst season of his career, scoring only 8 times. Although Baltimore had home ice advantage in the first rounds of the playoffs, the fans were nervous because Baltimore had never won a playoff series in its team's history. The team was set to play the Quebec Aces. In 1951, when Jimmy was in his last year playing junior hockey with St. Jerome, Quebec had a junior team named the Citadels, who was coached by fiery Phil Watson. After they were both suspended by the league for fighting and spitting in each other's faces during a match, Watson, who saw a younger version of himself in Bartlett, poached him from the Canadiens organization and made him a New York Ranger. But it was Phil Watson who also sold him to Providence in 1961 when he took over as coach of the Bruins, which ended Jimmy's NHL career. After being fired himself from Boston, Watson was also now back in the AHL in his first year as the coach of the Quebec Aces. And of course, Bartlett was determined to punish his old coach and make him pay. Quebec was led by the AHL's leading scorer Gordon Labossiere with 95 points and 40 goals. When Gordy was owned by the New York Rangers, he previously played for the Clippers, where he had a club record when he scored 38 goals in 1964, a record that was just beaten by Doug Robinson. The following season, he was traded to the Canadiens, who assigned him to Quebec, where he scored 31 times in only 63 games. After 2 disappointing seasons in the NHL with Los Angeles, Gordy was lent to the Springfield Kings, where he was second in the AHL in scoring and named a second-team All-Star. In 1972, Gordy scored 36 goals when he jumped to the World Hockey Association's Houston Aeros, and he played 4 seasons with Houston before retiring, winning 2 league championships, playing with Mr. Hockey himself, Gordie Howe. Also named the first-team All-Star in 1966 was Quebec's high-scoring American-born right winger, Wayne Hicks, who had 91 points and 31 goals that year. After spending a few mediocre years with Calgary in the Western League, the Blackhawks-owned Hicks was demoted to the lower-level Eastern Professional Hockey League's Sault Ste. Marie Thunderbirds, where he scored 30 goals in 1959. Hicks would be promoted to the AHL and scored 20 goals the next 2 seasons as a member of the Buffalo Bisons. He was called up to play in one playoff game by the Blackhawks after the 1960-61 season. Luckily for him, it was April 16, 1961, the game in which the Chicago Blackhawks actually won the Stanley Cup. After scoring only 7 goals for the Boston Bruins in 1962, Hicks was sold to Montreal, who lent him to the Quebec Aces, where he would score more than 30 goals in 4 consecutive seasons. The Quebec Aces also had the AHL's Rookie of the Year, Bobby Rivard. Bobby, who was nicknamed Rivet, may have been listed in hockey programs as being 5'8", but he was often teased by Bartlett that he must have been wearing his skates at the time his height was measured. He may have been small, but that didn't prevent the gritty, high-flying Rivard from being an offensive dynamo. Bobby played junior hockey for the Peterborough Petes, where in 1959 they won the Ontario Hockey League Championship for the first time before losing in the finals of the Memorial Cup National Junior Hockey Championships under their young coach and Jimmy's high school classmate, Scotty Bowman. Before joining the Quebec Aces, Rivet starred for 6 seasons in the International League, where he won 2 league championships with the Fort Wayne Comets. In 1964, Rivet was named the first-team All-Star in the IHL, scoring 46 goals with 70 assists. In 1965, Rivet was even better, leading the entire league in scoring with 42 goals and a staggering 91 assists. And despite being small, Rivard was far from fragile. In 4 seasons with the Comets, he never missed a game, establishing the franchise record by appearing in 280 consecutive games. Even smaller than Rivard was another French Aces rookie, the 5'7" René Drolet, who previously played junior hockey for the Quebec Citadels. The 21-year-old center would play the next 5 seasons for the Quebec Aces and remain with the organization when it relocated to Richmond, Virginia in 1971. In 1968, Drolet would score 20 goals, which he would do for 10 consecutive seasons. In 1975, Drolet would head to Rochester, where he would remain for his final 4 years, retiring after scoring 298 goals. Quebec's leader, however, was the 34-year-old future AHL Hall of Fame defenseman Jim Morrison. 17 years earlier, Morrison had been Jimmy's teammate during Bart's first year playing junior hockey with the Verdun Maple Leafs. A fast-skating, offensive-minded defenseman, Morrison would play in 3 consecutive NHL All-Star games as a member of the Toronto Maple Leafs. After spending 10 years in the NHL, the New York Rangers sold Morrison to the Quebec Aces, where he would star for the next 8 seasons, 4 times being named the second-team All-Star. And in 1965, Morrison won the Eddie Shore Award as the league's best defenseman. On April 5, 1967, the Baltimore Clippers totally dominated the Quebec Aces from the opening faceoff in the team's 4-1 victory in Game 1 of the 5-game series, when goals by Marshall, Cunningham, and Bartlett gave the Clippers a 3-0 lead heading into the third period. After the game, Jimmy predicted that the Quebec Aces would be a much tougher team in Game 2 than the team that had just lost at the Civic Center. According to Jimmy, Phil Watson would be giving them plenty of hell and probably clamp a tough curfew on them, and they'd probably come out flying. According to The Sun, getting back to his favorite subject himself, Jimmy commented, "Well, the money players came through tonight, didn't they?" Bartlett was proven right when the Clippers were humiliated 8-1 in Game 2 at the Civic Center. Villemure was chased from the game and replaced by Boisvert when the score was 6-0. The Clippers avoided a shutout when Jean-Marie Cossette scored in the game's final minute. In Game 3, with the score tied 4-4 in the third period, Quebec's Bobby Rivard scored what proved to be the game winner in the team's 7-4 loss. The Clippers needed a road win to avoid elimination in Game 4 and were down 3-0. However, Villemure would not give up another goal, and Marshall and Cossette scored into the second period. With less than 8 minutes remaining in the game, Billy Knibbs took a pass from Bobby Plager and tied the score. 2 minutes later, Billy Hickey, after battling for and digging the puck out of the boards, fired the unassisted game-winning goal past Quebec's Gary Bowman to complete the team's thrilling must-win. The Baltimore fans were entertained by an exciting, well-played Game 5. In the first period, Willie Marshall gave the Clippers a 1-0 lead, but 2 minutes later, Rivard tied it up for Quebec on a fluky deflection off of a shot by Morrison. Ron Ingram broke the tie when he scored in the second period. The lead rose to 3-1 when Bob Cunningham fired home a nifty 10-footer, with Jim Bartlett and Sandy McGregor doing the tough work and digging the puck off the boards to feed Cunningham for the score. Despite being down 2 goals late in the second period, Quebec fought back and tied the score at 7:55 of the third period. However, a minute later, Bartlett picked up his second point of the night when he and Cunningham set up Sandy McGregor to give the Clippers a 4-3 edge. A minute after that, Doug Robinson of the top line scored the clincher, and despite a goal by Lobassiere in the final 2 minutes, the Clippers held on to a 5-4 victory, winning their first ever playoff series in history and providing serious payback against fiery Phil Watson. In the second round of the playoffs, the Clippers had to play the mighty Rochester Americans, who had won the Calder Cup the previous 2 seasons and were trying for a three-peat. In those 3 years, the Clippers had only one win against the Amherst squad that was loaded from top to bottom. Goalie Bob Perreault had help preventing goals with a pair of tough defensemen who had played with Bartlett in Springfield, Kent Douglas and AHL Hall of Famer Don Cherry. Rochester also had 28-year-old Dwayne Rupp, who in 1962 and 63 had been a teammate of Sandy McGregor in the Clippers' first 2 seasons. After the Rangers traded Rupp to Toronto the following year, he was assigned to the Americans, where he was twice named the second-team All-Star. Rupp would be traded to Pittsburgh in 1969 for Leo Boivin, where he would play for 5 seasons, becoming the first Penguin defenseman to ever score a hat trick. In 1973, Rupp would return to the AHL and was again named the second-team All-Star, winning the Calder Cup with the Hershey Bears. After 2 seasons playing in the World Hockey Association, Rupp finally retired in 1977 after a final season playing for the Amerks. The true backbone of Rochester's blue line was Al Arbour. Arbour was the AHL's best defensive defenseman, willing to sacrifice his body with his fearless shot blocking. After playing a couple seasons in the NHL for the Red Wings and 3 years for the Blackhawks, Arbour was poached by the Toronto Maple Leafs in 1961. After a season with the Leafs, Toronto lent him to Rochester. With the Amerks, Arbour was a first-team All-Star for 4 consecutive seasons, winning the Eddie Shore Award as the AHL's best defenseman in 1964. After the NHL's expansion, Arbour would become the St. Louis Blues' first-ever captain and would play 4 seasons before ending his career as a player. Arbour, of course, was eventually inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame after leading the New York Islanders to 4 consecutive Stanley Cup titles as their head coach. Rochester also had plenty of star forwards. Jimmy's former teammate from Chicoutimi, 37-year-old Stan Smirk, scored 30 goals in his final season. Left winger Don Blackburn scored 20 goals after scoring 36 times the year before for the Quebec Aces. In 1967, Blackburn would jump to the NHL and play a few years for the Flyers, with a short stint in Baltimore in 1968. In 1969, Blackburn would be named the second-team All-Star as a member of the Calder Cup-winning Buffalo Bisons, and would be named the first-team All-Star in 1970 when he returned to the Amerks. In 1971, as a member of the Rhode Island Reds, Blackburn would lead the league in scoring. In 72, Blackburn would return to the NHL as a member of the Islanders before ending his career with the Whalers of the World Hockey Association, before becoming the Hartford Whalers' first coach when they joined the NHL in 1979. The Americans also had a trio of AHL Hall of Fame forwards. One was the 36-year-old former star of the Uke line, Bronco Horvath, Bartlett's former teammate with the Bruins, who had 29 goals. Another was Rochester's captain, Jerry Ehman, who scored 33 goals, his 5th consecutive season with more than 30 goals. In 1957, Ehman scored 40 goals as a member of Eddie Shore's Springfield squad and was selected as the AHL's first-team All-Star at right wing. He was able to escape hockey hell the following season when he was traded to the Toronto Maple Leafs. After playing 1958 and 1959 for Toronto, Jerry was assigned to Rochester in 1960 and was named the second-team All-Star. In 1963, Jerry led the American Hockey League in scoring and was called up to the Leafs for 9 games in the playoffs, where he won the Stanley Cup. In 1965, Jerry was again named the first-team All-Star with the Amerks after scoring 39 goals and leading the team to their second consecutive Calder Cup. In 1967, the Leafs sold Ehman's right to the expansion Oakland Seals, where he would play in the NHL for 4 seasons before retiring. On October 31st, 2023, the American Hockey League announced his induction into the Hall of Fame. However, the biggest star of all for Rochester was the greatest left winger in AHL history, Dick Gamble. Like so many other players of his generation, Dick Gamble, who was nicknamed Grumps, was born at the wrong time. Even though Gamble scored 23 goals as a rookie for the Montreal Canadiens, he still couldn't secure a permanent roster spot with the Habs, who sold him to the Buffalo Bisons. Gamble scored 168 goals in his 5 seasons with Buffalo. In his final year with the Bisons, Gamble scored 40 goals and was a first-team All-Star. When his contract was traded to the Maple Leafs, Toronto assigned him to Rochester in 1961, where he played until he retired in 1970 as a player coach. After scoring 30 goals in each of Gamble's 3 seasons with the Amerks, Gamble upped his game in 1964 when he scored 48 goals. In 1965, Gamble was the American Hockey League's MVP when he led the league with both 47 goals and 98 points, and in 1966, at the age of 39, Gamble scored 46 goals. Gamble, who is still the AHL's 5th all-time leading scorer with 892 points and his 4th all-time in goals, was inducted into the American Hockey League Hall of Fame in 2006. The Clippers were definitely the underdogs heading into Game 1, and Rochester's coach Joe Crozier arrogantly predicted a 3-game sweep. But on April 16, 1967, the Clippers played their best game of the season and completely dominated the Amerks. Black Bart scored in the game's first 5 minutes with a helper from Brinkworth. Rochester's fans were stunned when Bill Hickey scored his second goal of the game at 7:44 of the third period to give Baltimore a 3-1 lead. But for some strange reason, Hickey was penalized for slashing while scoring his goal. Of course, Rochester was then able to score on their power play, and with 5 minutes remaining in regulation, deflected another goal past Villemure to tie the score. Meanwhile, despite their superior play, the Clippers must have offended the hockey gods because the Clippers just could not find the back of the net. The Clippers almost won it when Doug Robinson's deflected shot just missed the corner of the net and went wide. During overtime, both Villemure and Perreault were brilliant. Bartlett had a chance to win it for the Clippers in OT, but his close-in shot went wide. The game was the longest game in Bartlett's career and did not end until Jerry Ehman scored the game winner for Rochester in the 3rd sudden death overtime period. "If only I had shot it hard," Bartlett lamented after the game about missing the game winner, "but I thought the whistle had blown." In Game 2, neither team scored in the first period, though Bartlett and Rochester's Don Blackburn were both thrown into the penalty box for throwing a few punches at each other. In the second period, Marshall scored for the Clippers and Gamble tied it up. Then Bartlett, receiving a perfect pass from Cunningham, gave the Clippers a 2-1 lead. In the third period, Robinson, Marshall, and Hickey scored in the Clippers' 5-3 win in Rochester. Willie's second goal in the game was his 107th playoff point of his career, which broke Fred Glover's AHL's postseason career scoring record. The series headed to Baltimore for Game 3 with momentum clearly favoring the Clippers. But on April 21st, the Clippers were shut out at home 4-0. The only time the Baltimore fans were able to cheer during the game was in the third period when Plager unleashed a bloody beating of Rochester's Wayne Carleton. In Game 4, goals by Rod Seiling, Billy Knibbs, and Bill Hickey gave the Clippers a 3-0 lead after the first period. Perot was replaced in the net by Rochester's backup goalie Bruce Gamble, who previously played on the Bruins with Bartlett. It seemed as if the Clippers were going to coast to another win when Bartlett gave the team a 4-2 lead in the second period with assists from Cunningham and Nick Polano. But the Clippers' defense then completely collapsed, allowing 4 unanswered goals in the final 9 minutes of the second period as the Clippers blew another 2-goal lead and were eliminated in the playoffs by Rochester with a 7-5 loss. However, Rochester's dream of a three-peat ended on April 30th when the Americans were swept in the finals by the Pittsburgh Hornets and their ageless defenseman Doug Harvey in the team's last season in the American Hockey League. Although the Clippers didn't win the Calder Cup and were denied an NHL team, the season was still a huge success, with the team winning its very first playoff series. And Embry and Krieger still hadn't given up on the dream of the Clippers joining the NHL. But the 1966-67 season was now complete, and the original six era of hockey was now over. The hockey world was soon going to be turned completely upside down.